Preparing your infrastructure and installing your first Exchange server. Okay, so you've had some opportunity now to get a feel for the different roles that an Exchange server can hold. You kind of at this point should have an understanding of how those roles interconnect and all the different pieces that are required for you to have a fully realized Exchange infrastructure. At this point, you're probably ready to start installing Exchange and getting yourself ready for actually processing mail in your domain. Now, before you can actually go through and install Exchange, there are obviously some preparatory tasks that you're going to have to go through to really get your domain and your forest ready to go. We're going to talk about those preparatory tasks in this nugget. And we're going to also go through the process of installing that very first Exchange server and all the different pieces that are required for Exchange to be fully functional. In this nugget, we're going to talk about how we have to go through preparing for installing Exchange, some of the hardware and software requirements. We're going to actually prepare that Active Directory domain and specifically its schema. You obviously want to make sure that you have the correct domain functional level at least Windows Server 2003 or greater. Now, in this case, we're going to be using, as I said before, Windows Server 2008 R2 as not only the servers but also the domain functional level. So we're at the most recent version of Windows. We're going to talk also about configuring DNS and also your sites to support that Exchange server environment. Remember that Exchange and all the different roles that are involved with Exchange Exchange 2010 very specifically follows your Active Directory site structure. And so you're going to need to have your site structure created first and really positioned first before you really start provisioning out your Exchange servers. Now, we have some prerequisites involved with installing Exchange, Windows PowerShell 2.0, the Microsoft .NET Framework version 3.5, WinRM 2.0, and then this 2007 Office System Converter, the Microsoft Filter Pack. These are going to be these prerequisites that are required for Exchange to actually function. Now, if you're using Windows Server 2008, the RTM version, you'll have to install some of these manually before you start the Exchange process. If you're using 2008 R2, some of these are already installed onto your server because they're just simply part of the R2 installation. And then once we've got all those prerequisites installed, we're going to go through that process of installing Exchange. I'll show you the standard and the custom installation. I'll explain a little bit about the command line installation, just give you an understanding, a feeling about how you can go through the installation process. And once we're complete, we're going to actually go through verifying and troubleshooting that Exchange server installation. Now, before we actually go through really clicking through the buttons in our Exchange infrastructure, let's spend just a minute talking about the different hardware and software requirements that you need to be aware of, or at least conscious of, as you're going through speccing out your Exchange infrastructure. I really want to focus in on processor and RAM because these are kind of the two big ones when you're thinking about what kinds of servers you may purchase to host Exchange. Now, Exchange requires an x64 based processor, and it doesn't really matter if it's Intel or AMD, but Intel Itanium IA64 processors are not going to be supported. And when you're actually determining how many processors you'll need, that determination will depend on what sorts of roles you plan on installing to that Exchange server. Now, obviously, there are a number of different roles that are possible. You can have a hub transport role or a client access server or unified messaging or a mailbox server. And you can also have combinations of those as well. Now, these pieces of guidance, these specific requirements or recommendations here relate to an Exchange organization that is of scale, of fairly decent size. If you are a smaller organization where you only have a small number of mailboxes and maybe that non-MAPI client traffic, just not that much of non-typical Outlook traffic, you probably won't need this many cores and this much RAM assigned to your Exchange server, but at least this gives you an idea of, as you scale that Exchange infrastructure upward, how many processors you're going to need, how many processor cores you're going to need, and also how much RAM down here at the bottom. Hub transport roles, Microsoft suggests that 8 cores will support several mailbox servers and thousands of mailboxes. So with an 8-core server, your hub transport should be able to route mail for lots and lots of mailboxes for a rather large organization. For client access server, 4 cores will support the needs of a large organization. Again, this is Microsoft's parlance. Whereas 2 cores, however, will support organizations with a small number of mailboxes, or again, not a lot of that non-typical client traffic if you're not using things like Microsoft Outlook. Unified Messaging Server, however, the recommended configuration is 8 cores here, and that's because Unified Messaging has a lot of real-time requirements. It also has really a lot of this rendering requirements for it to be able to convert voicemail into email, more or less. And so a lot of processing power is really required. You'll see here, even for smaller organizations, having 2 or 4 cores is required for those smaller organizations. Now, we don't talk about Unified Messaging really much at all in this nugget, but you'll just be aware of this if you plan on implementing unified messaging in your environment. Now, the real heavy lifting is required inside your mailbox server, and here you can see that the recommendation is for 4 cores. That now those 4 cores should be able to host, again, several thousand mailboxes. Again, don't forget the fact that you can combine these roles together onto a single server, and in fact, we're going to be doing that here in just a little bit. We'll be combining the mailbox server, the client access server, and the hub transport server onto a single server so we can see how those roles interrelate. Down here on the bottom, we have some recommendations here when it comes to RAM. Our edge transport and our hub transport servers, 2 gigs minimum, 16 gigs max, really 1 gig per core is recommended. You can see here how you'll want to scale the amount of RAM with the number of cores that you're going to be assigning to the servers that are going to be providing these roles. Client access server, again, 2 gigs minimum, 16 gigs max, but 2 gigs per core is recommended. A little bit more for unified messaging, 4, 8, and 2. And then those mailbox servers, those are really the ones you're going to want to spec out specifically based off of the number of mailboxes you'll have. You'll see here that 2 gigs is a minimum with 64 gigs is a maximum for that mailbox server. And really what Microsoft's recommendations, if you go to their website and kind of poke through to find out what their specific recommendations are, Microsoft recommends 4 gigabytes of RAM plus between 3 and 30 megabytes per mailbox. And so the difference between 3 megabytes and 30 megabytes really has to do with the class of user that will be using that mailbox. If you've got light users, they're probably going to be down more towards the 3 megabytes per mailbox. If you've got more heavy users, they're going to be more towards the 30 megabytes per mailbox. Very, very important that you spec those servers so that they can support the processing and RAM requirements for the users, or your users are just going to have a poor user's experience. Now, in terms of software requirements, you can see down here at the bottom the operating system requirements. There really are 2 different versions of the Windows Server operating system that are supported by Exchange 2010. One is Windows Server 2008 RTM, and that's only Service Pack 2 or greater, or Windows Server 2008 R2. Now, in this infrastructure, in this series of videos, I'm going to be using Windows Server 2008 R2 as the operating system. And so if you're using one of the earlier versions, you're going to have just a little bit of difference between how you're going to go through some of the things. Really, those differences are going to be mostly here in the installation process, not so much actually after you actually get the software installed. Now, obviously, that operating system is only the start. It's only the first thing that you need to be aware of whenever you're considering the software requirements for Microsoft Exchange. There are actually some other pretty significant software requirements that you do have to be aware of. I first talked about these when we were discussing just the contents of this particular nugget, but there are those Exchange prerequisites out there. Again, Windows PowerShell 2, the .NET Framework, etc., etc. I want to focus you in on this website, this TechNet website here, that talks about the Windows roles and features that you're going to have available if you want to really successfully install Exchange. Here they are. This is the website here, and it talks about those Exchange 2010 prerequisites, and it really focuses them in on the different prerequisites for each of the different operating systems. Now, first is Windows Server 2008 Service Pack 2. If you're using Server 2008 Service Pack 2, you're going to have some things installed. You're going to have that .NET Framework 3.5, Service Pack 1, the Family Update, WinRM 2.0, Windows PowerShell 2.0. These are not part of the default Windows Server installation, so you're going to have to install them separately. If you have those hub transport and mailbox server roles, also make sure you install the Microsoft Filter Pack, which is at this location here. Again, Office 2007 System Converter Microsoft Filter Pack. This is actually the website that it looks like. Literally, you download this installation. It's a very small installation and install it to that server. Switching back, however, though, After you get these prerequisites installed, there are a number of roles, role services, and features that are required for the Windows operating system to really be prepared for Exchange. Now you can see down here that we have this scconfig tool that we're using to actually start the NetTCP port sharing service, essentially set the startup for that to auto. And then we're also using the tool Server Manager CMD, which is the command line version of Server Manager, to install a set of predefined roles, role services, and features. Now, on that Exchange 2010 installation media is going to be a file here called exchange-typical.xml. This XML file is used by Server Manager CMD to install the correct roles, role services, and features. Rather than just giving you the list of what these are, because there are quite a few, Microsoft has actually rolled them up into this nice XML file. You literally run this single command here, this single Server Manager CMD command, restart the computer, and then you have all the roles installed in the proper way. Which of the different types of Exchange roles that you plan on installing to your server is going to depend on which of these you're going to actually need to install. Now you'll notice up here that for a server that will have the typical installation of the client access, hub transport, and the mailbox role, this is the typical Exchange installation, you're going to have to run these two commands. Now this is going to be different, however, if you're going to run different Exchange roles on that same Windows server. Client access, hub transport, mailbox, and server roles have a little bit different piece down here. Again, it's different if you have client access and hub transport, or hub transport and mailbox. So you can see that the things that are required for you to prepare your Windows Server 2008 installation for Exchange is going to be different based off of what types of Exchange roles you plan to install. As I said, this is for Windows Server 2008, the RTM version. If you're going to be using R2, if I scroll down here just a little bit, you'll see that we no longer are going to be using Server Manager CMD. In R2, Server Manager CMD is deprecated at this point. Microsoft really wants you to use PowerShell. So you'll see that instead of using Server Manager CMD, we're instead using PowerShell to import those roles, role services, and features. The first step is actually to import the Server Manager module into PowerShell. This essentially allows PowerShell to interact with Server Manager. And then once you've done that, you'll go down here and then simply copy and paste this script into a PowerShell window to install the correct roles, role services, and features. Just like before, however, be aware that depending on the type of Exchange roles that you plan on installing, again, client access, hub transport, mailbox, or what have you, you're going to have a different set of commands that you're going to need to plug into your PowerShell window. This one's going to be just a little bit different than this one, and as we scroll down here for the different options that are available, they're going to be different again. Literally, in just a minute, I'm going to go and copy and paste this command into a PowerShell window to have it go through the process of installing all of these components to prepare ourselves for Exchange. So these really represent the basics that are necessary for installation to prepare yourself for Exchange, but there's still some extra work that's required. Before we can actually go through the Exchange installation, we need to go through a couple of different steps involving extending the schema, ensuring that correct domain functional level, and then also taking a look at our DNS and our sites to make sure that they will indeed support the Exchange server environment. Let's actually start by taking a look at the Active Directory domain and the schema, because that's the first step to preparing ourselves for an Exchange organization. The schema extension process with Exchange is really the same as that same process you've gone through whenever you've upgraded your domain from, for example, 2003 to 2008, or when you upgraded from 2000 to 2003. It's the same kind of schema extension, at least the same process that you went through there. So if you've done that before, you're fairly familiar with what you need to do to prepare the schema for Exchange. Now we're taking a look here. Here's the Exchange server we're going to look at, and on this Exchange server, we've already actually copied up the Exchange binaries, the Exchange DVD, so it's connected into the CD drive here. Now we want to actually run this schema extension not from the Exchange server, but instead from the domain controller that's actually going to be running this schema. Right? This is the domain controller that has the schema role holder, the schema master role holder for our domain. That machine actually is this computer. And so from this computer, we actually need to run that schema extension. Now, of primary importance before you actually run this schema extension is to make sure that the user account that you're planning on using to run the schema extension has schema admin privileges. Now, I'm logged in here as an administrator, and if I double click administrator here and go to member of, you'll see that administrator has enterprise admins and schema admins privileges in this domain. You're going to want to make sure that, again, that user account indeed has enterprise admins and schema admins privileges. The other thing, too, is to make sure that you're running on the domain controller that is a schema master role holder, and you can check that by using the ntdsutil command to verify whether it is or is not the schema master role holder. Once you've verified that you have the correct permissions to do so and that you're on the right domain controller, the process of actually preparing that schema really happens from the command line. So you'll see here I have the command line up and I'm looking at the C drive. What I want to do is change to the D drive. So let me go ahead and bring up a command prompt here. I'm going to click on Run and CMD, and then I'm going to navigate over to the D drive, which is where the Exchange DVD has been plugged into. There are a number of different preparations that you need to go through in order to get that domain and that forest prepared for Exchange. If I do a dir here, you'll see that we've got a lot of different files and folders on that Exchange DVD, and the one we're looking for here is setup.exe. Now, there are a number of different of these preparation tasks that are required. The first one is using the setup tool, and it's prepare legacy exchange permissions. Now, the only time you'll actually use this is if you have existing computers in your organization running Exchange 2003. Now, a lot of us are going to be making that jump from 2003 to 2010, and we're going to need to prepare those legacy Exchange permissions before we actually go through the schema changes there. You can shorten this by doing just PL if you want. Now, in this case, I don't actually have any of these any Exchange 2003 servers in my organization at this point, so the first command that I'm going to use here is prepare schema, which is also shortened to PS. If I click Setup Prepare Schema, you'll see here that I'm welcome to the Exchange Server unattended setup. If I hit any key here, it'll actually cancel that setup. If I allow it to run, however, it's going to go through that process of extending the schema. So what I want to do here is pause for just long enough for it to recognize that I do indeed accept those license terms, and you'll see that its setup will actually go through and copy the setup files and prepare the Exchange setup. Now at this point, I'm going to pause the recording while we go through this process so you don't have to wait for this setup to occur. When we get to the other side, we'll actually get to the completion of the schema preparation. And we're back. You'll see that we've completed copying the setup files, we've done some organization checks here, and we've gone through the process of extending the Active Directory schema. Now this is step 2. We have step 3 also that's required for us to actually continue down this process. Let me go ahead and bring up another command prompt here. And what I want to do at this point is use the command from the D drive again, setup/prepare AD. Now what this is going to do is actually go through and prepare Active Directory. Now when I use this command, there's another switch that we actually have to use called organization name. And in here we're going to put the organization name that we're going to want to use for this Exchange organization that we're creating. In this case, I'm going to use Nugget Lab as the organization name. If I click the button here and begin the process, it goes through that same unattended setup process just like before. If we pause just a little bit and don't actually hit any keys here, we won't go through canceling the setup. We want that setup to go through and complete. And then once it's gone through and timed out for this ability for me to review the license terms, it's going to go through the process again of copying some setup files, of performing some organization checks, and then preparing the organization for use. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and pause this, and when we come back, all of these processes, all of these preparatory tasks will be complete. And as you can see, we're back once again. The second step here, technically the third, although we skipped one, has been completed successfully. You'll see here we've copied the setup files, we've performed a set of organization checks, and then we've gone through the preparation of this organization. Note that we have one error message here that refers to the fact that there are no Exchange 2007 server roles that have been detected in this topology, and after this operation you'll not be able to install any further Exchange 2000 server roles. This is just to make you aware that you're going to be moving to Exchange 2010. Now, the last step that we have to do here is to bring up yet another command prompt here, and what we want to do is actually go through the preparing of the domain. Again, we're going to use the setup command here. I've got to move over to the D drive and do the setup command, and it's prepare domain. Now, if I have multiple domains, I'm going to have to run this in those multiple domains. I can use a colon here and put in the FQDN of the domain that I want to prepare if I have a specific domain. Or if I'm just going to do this domain, the local domain, I can do prepare domain. Or alternatively, if I want to do all the domains all at once, I can do prepare all domains if I want. Now, in this case, I only have one domain, so I want to prepare just this single domain and get it ready for exchange. Same process as before. We go through waiting for the agreement to the license terms, and then once we're complete, we've gone through the process of preparing this domain. I'm not going to make you wait for this process to complete, but I want to get you to the other side of it, that now that we've completed these preparation tasks, then we can go through the process of actually looking at our Exchange server, preparing our sites, looking at our DNS server, our settings, and all those things that get us ready for really installing Exchange. And it appears this process is completed successfully. Again, we've copied the setup files, done those organization checks, and then prepared that domain to completion. Two things we want to take a look at now are DNS and the sites and services settings. I'm not going to spend much time on DNS here, mainly because a lot of the DNS discussion is going to be related to the designing topic, which Don will talk about for the other exam. But really, what you need to be aware of is that any of these servers that you plan on using inside of your Exchange organization must be inside of your DNS as well. And Don will spend more time talking about the design of DNS, but those servers need to be available in DNS, and they also need to be available so they can be accessed not only from the inside but also from the outside. Your outside exposure to DNS may be different than your inside exposure. You may have different domain names. You may have to set up split-brain DNS between the outside and the inside to have successful connectivity to those servers. So make sure you have DNS prepared, otherwise you're not going to be able to route traffic inbound and outbound out of your Exchange organization. But again, a lot of these DNS topics really a matter for the design stuff that are in the other half of this two-part series on Exchange. Now, what we do really need to talk about here, however, are the Active Directory sites and services settings here. Again, this is a default installation of Windows, and so this is just a single domain controller with a single domain and a single site, and really there hasn't been any configuration of sites and services here other than the default. But I want to bring this up specifically because you may not have actually created your sites and services settings correctly in your organization. If you have an organization that is larger than just a single site, well, you may not have made any of the changes here. Or even if you do have multiple sites in your organization, you may not have actually gone through and created your sites and services settings correctly. Now again, I have to focus on the sites and services settings because your sites and services settings for Active Directory are the same sorts of settings that you're going to use for Exchange in Exchange 2010. Now let me scroll through a couple of these here. You can see that we have our default first site name. This is the first site that gets created when you create a Windows domain. Perhaps we'll just rename this here to something that's a little more useful to us. Maybe we'll call this the Denver site, for example. Now you'll see that the Denver site here has already existing in it one of the domain controllers. This is DC Nugget. The other thing we want to make sure is that we have a global catalog in that site because Exchange requires the local global catalog. It actually makes use of that local global catalog for some of the processing of its mail. If I right-click here on NTDS settings associated with DC Nugget and choose Properties, you'll see that there's an important checkbox here that instructs whether or not this domain controller is going to be a global catalog or not. Again, the positioning of global catalogs and sites and services and domain controllers in your organization, again, a very design-specific topic, but important to recognize here is that you got to have at least a global catalog in this site for you to be able to correctly work with Exchange. Now, we already have this here because it is the first domain controller in this organization. But just be aware of this, so you'll want to make sure you do have global catalogs correctly positioned in your environment. The other thing you may want to do also is to assign the subnet to the correct site so that you will have the correct auto assignment of domain controllers down in the future into those sites. I can create a new subnet here by right-clicking on Subnets and choosing New and then Subnet. Now here I can have a prefix for this subnet, for example. Maybe my prefix will be 192.168.0.0/24. This is the prefix that I'm currently using for this subnet that I'm using. And then I can assign that to the site object for the Denver site. Click OK here, and then that actually creates this subnet so that any future domain controllers will get automatically located into the correct site, and it creates our sites and services topology correctly. So again, be conscious of that sites and services topology. Make sure you've done all the things you need in order to be successful with it, because it's important before we actually get into the installation of Microsoft Exchange. We're still not there yet, though. We still have some more things that we have to do to get this whole organization ready to go. I want to minimize this. I think we're done with the domain controller for now. What I want to do is return us back to this potential Exchange server. This is the server that we're about to install Exchange to. Now remember that there are a couple of different Exchange prerequisites that are required for us to actually get all those roles, role services, and features installed. And that's going to be using PowerShell to actually install those. I'm going to go ahead and copy this scriptlet here to the clipboard, because I'm going to use this to install all the pieces we need for a typical installation of the client access role, the hub transport role, and the mailbox role. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to have to use Windows PowerShell again here, and I'm going to launch the PowerShell command prompt here. And once the PowerShell command prompt here, I'm going to have to import the module for, you can't spell here, import module, and then server manager. Okay, that's going to import the Server Manager functionality into this PowerShell console, and then allow me to actually go through and paste in this Add Windows Feature commandlet here. Now, when I hit the button, it's going to actually go through the process of starting that installation, installing all those components, and really preparing this server for the installation. Once it's complete, if you'll notice, I actually added the restart switch in there. That restart switch will instruct the server to actually go through and complete the restart. When we come back, we'll have all the pieces installed that we needed, and then we'll actually be able to finally get to the point where we can double-click and install Microsoft Exchange. And we're back! And we're finally ready to start installing Exchange. You can see here that the right roles and features have been installed. We got the web server role that's been installed, RPC over HTTP proxy, some of the other pieces that are required just simply to get Exchange up and running. I just wanted to show you this inside of Server Manager to prove that we've installed all the pieces that are necessary. I've also got the Exchange Server 2010 installation sort of splash screen set up here, and you can see step 1 and step 2 have already been completed. That is the installation of the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1, and also the installation of Windows PowerShell version 2. At this point, we can actually go through the process of choosing our Exchange language option, which in this case is going to be only the languages from the DVD. We're not interested in all the languages from the language bundle. And then lastly, installing Microsoft Exchange. Now, this process of installing Microsoft Exchange is going to have a couple of different settings that we're going to have to configure as part of the installation. Just some initial stuff that we have to instruct Exchange to do or to configure as it goes through that initial setup. And we're going to run through those steps now. I'm going to click the Next button here and start the setup here. Obviously, I have to approve the terms of the licensing agreement to get to the next step. If you want to enable Exchange error reporting, what this does is essentially feeds information to Microsoft if you have a problem with your Exchange organization. It can be a good idea to help Microsoft improve later versions of Exchange. Some people don't really like this feature because they fear that Microsoft is collecting information about them. But if you're interested in helping Microsoft out, you can choose yes here. I'm going to click the Next button here, and I can choose the installation type at this point. Now, there are really two types of installations. The first is the typical, and the other is the custom Exchange Server installation. And really what we want to do here is we want to install the hub transport, client access, and the mailbox roles, because those are the three roles that are required just to get the most basic Exchange organization up and running. If you wanted to do specific roles, if you wanted to break out an individual role and just install one piece, or install perhaps even more than just those three roles, you could do a custom Exchange Server installation down here and specifically check off the ones that you're looking for. In our case, we're just going to do a typical installation because we're going to do some of those other custom roles a little down the road, specifically when we have to do things like the Edge Transport role, for example. I can also specify a different path for the Exchange Server program files. In this case, I'm just going to leave that as the default and choose this typical Exchange Server installation here. If you are going to have computers running Outlook 2003 or Microsoft Entourage, there's going to have to be a specific public folder database that gets created in order for those to really operate. Now, if you choose no here, you could potentially create that public folder database down the road. This is not a one-time chance for you. In this case, we're not going to really run any of those older or different operating system versions of Outlook, so we're going to choose no here and click the next button. And then we want to choose whether we want to actually at this point configure the client access server external domain. Now the client access server, recall, is used not only inside but can also be used for internet based clients, for them to connect in and work with their internal mailbox servers. We are not at the point yet where we really want to actually do this configuration. We're going to do this in a later nugget. So at this point, we're not yet going to configure the client access server role to be internet facing. If you were, you would check this box here and then enter in the external DNS address, the FQDN, for that client access server. Now again, we're not going to do that at this point, so we're going to uncheck the box and move on. Customer Experience Improvement Program, similar to the error reporting program, but in this case it just provides, again, some information to Microsoft about the experience that your customers are experiencing with your Exchange 2010 organization. Those are really the big things that we have to do for this installation. At this point, what Exchange is going to do is run through a set of readiness checks to ensure that you've done all of the things correctly before it actually goes through the installation. If you recall back a series or a number of versions ago, we didn't have these readiness checks, so you sort of had to be perfect in all of your things that you did before you started the installation. Now we know that because we can go through this readiness check and get the green check mark next to all the different pieces, we know that we've done all the things correctly. And you can see why this is a particularly handy tool, because of all the different things that we had to do to prepare our Exchange organization. And in fact, we even missed a step in going through that preparation task. You'll notice here that we have a failed entry here in one of the readiness checks because we didn't actually set the start mode for the net.tcp port sharing service to automatic, and we have to do that before setup can continue. And I wanted to do this specifically so I could show you what happens when you do get a failure here. I'm going to go back down here to our Internet Explorer instance here so we can take a look at what we missed. Now remember that we've already gone through this process of importing the Server Manager module here, but down here at the bottom, as we talked about, we need to set this service for NetTCP port sharing. We need to set that startup type to automatic. We can do that right within the services console, or we can do it within PowerShell. I'm going to actually do it within PowerShell again so you can take a look at it. So I'm going to go down here and then bring up a PowerShell command once again, because with Exchange we're going to be doing a lot of PowerShell work. The first thing I want to do is import module, or import dash module Server Manager, and then right click after I'm done with that to actually paste in this set service piece. This completes setting up that service and should actually give us what we need to actually go through and complete all of the readiness checks correctly. I'm going to click the retry button here, and you'll see it goes through all of those readiness checks once again. And I'm going to pause for just a minute while we allow those readiness checks to complete. And after a short pause, it looks like we've completed all of the readiness checks, and all of them had that nice green check marks that lets us know that we're ready to go through with the installation. I click the Install button here, and now we're going to go through the process of installing Exchange. This is going to go through preparing the setup and copying those Exchange files over, doing all of the service setup, installing and configuring all the initial settings for all the roles that we've prepared for, and really completing this process of installing Exchange. Now, once we're complete with the installation, the last thing that we're going to want to do is go through a set of post-installation tasks and also some verification that Exchange has actually been installed. Once you've completed your Exchange Server installation too, you want to verify that all of that Exchange Server stuff has been installed correctly. Now you can do that by taking a look at the Event Viewer. You can review the Event Viewer for errors and warnings. You can verify that those server roles were successfully installed. You can actually take a look at the log files also. Exchange has a set of log files in the folder C:\Exchange setup logs. These three tools are what you can do to verify that that Exchange Server installation is completed successfully and that you're really ready to begin working with your Exchange Server infrastructure. Now, by now, that Exchange installation should have completed at this point, and completed also the post-installation reboot to bring us back to essentially the Exchange Management Console. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this screen and go back to our Exchange Management Console, where you'll see those post-installation tasks like we were just talking about just a second ago. There are really three sets of post-installation tasks that you need to be aware of. There's finalizing the deployment tasks, there's these end-to-end scenario tasks, and there's also some additional post-installation tasks that you need to do. All three of these links bring up more or less a website that takes you directly to TechNet, where it gives you the list of things that you really need to do in order to fulfill the completion of bringing this Exchange organization online. You can see here for server roles here, we need to enter the product key information here. We need to protect our Exchange servers. We need to configure offline address books for the mailbox server role. Each of the individual roles is going to have its own set of post-installation tasks that Microsoft suggests that you do. And you look at the deployment tasks, you can look at the end-to-end scenario tasks, which deal with the whole environment as a comprehensive solution here. And you're going to want to go through all of these things just to make sure that you've got your Exchange server ready to go for processing mail. Now, we are going to go through pretty much all of these tasks, maybe not every single one of them. We're not going to talk much about unified messaging, but for the other ones, we're going to go through these in the succeeding series of nuggets. Over the rest of this series, we're going to go through again all of those steps that you're going to want to go through in order to configure your Exchange organization to prepare it for use. And so be aware of what these post-installation tasks, and you're going to learn about what these are and how they can be implemented in the upcoming nuggets. So really, this concludes what we want to talk about here in terms of installing our first Exchange server. And now we're going to move on to preparing our organization so that we can have clients connecting in to use it as their email platform. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.